morning, Minutemen. Let's take a little moment and review what we discussed last class. So, reincarnation is based on karma is a belief of what religion? Well, that actually would be a belief of two religions. Both Hindus and Buddhists believe in reincarnation. Now, if I was to mention the word caste system, then that makes it Hinduism. What are the sacred writings of Hindus? Those, of course, would be the Vedas and the Upanishads. They are considered to be the three baskets for Buddhists. Let me move up here today. All right. How did Hinduism spread? Remember, it's as easy as ABC that Ashoka sent Buddhist missionaries to China. And then, true or false, Ashoka's missionaries and their writings spread Buddhism from India to China and other parts of Asia. Oh, we just mentioned that. True. And the beliefs of Buddhism, the two main ones, so that would be the Eightfold Path and the Four Noble Truths. All right, so today we're talking about ancient China. All right, so China starts along the Huang River, also called the Yellow River, and it was geographically isolated. What other civilization have we just talked about that was isolated? India, right? So India is that peninsula, had the mountains in the north and the water in the south and the east and the west. So China is also kind of that way because China is very, very large. China is the fourth largest country in the world today. Number one is Russia, two is China. We're number three and they're number four, and they're very close to us in size. So people started invading from the north, coming in from the Gobi Desert, and that was mostly the Mongols. And the Great Wall was actually built to keep the Mongols out. The Mongols are very interesting people. They were nomadic warrior herders, very similar to the Aryans, and they were a mean fighting force. Chinese culture starts around 1500, although the more we learn about China, the older we can date it. The problem is that we have no written record until about 1500, and that's going to be because of oracle bones, which we'll talk about a little bit later today. There's a lot of significant contributions of Chinese society, and just to name a few among others, many inventions like silk and paper, but also West Eastern philosophies like Confucianism and Daoism. So here's the Yellow River. Do you notice that the Huang? So it literally means the great sorrow. It's also called the Yellow River because of the yellow tint to the color, and it has to do with the silt. Remember that silt is that rich, fertile land that comes up when the river floods. It can flood so much and do so much damage. That's why it was called the Great Sorrow. But there is particular minerals in the Chinese river that makes it have a yellow tint. So when we look at how Chinese society worked, when we finally get our emperors, remember that emperors are a dynasty where you have the father then passes to the son and so on. And so these dynasties were ruled by something called the mandate of heaven. So the mandate of heaven means that whoever was in charge had the authority to rule from heaven. So in the Middle Ages, we call this divine right, that kings got to rule because God had appointed them. This is the same concept, except they don't really believe in God per se. And so it's the concept that heaven or the other world has chosen them. But they could only rule as long as they were in control of the mandate of heaven. So here's kind of what happens. You get a new ruler. He's ruling his child, so on. Things are going pretty good. Then things start to go really bad. Then there is usually some type of invasion or attack, and suddenly the king has lost the mandate of heaven, and the new leader who comes in and proclaims that he has the mandate of heaven. And this was a cycle. We call this the dynastic cycle that we see consistently in Chinese culture. So you can see here so we have a new dynasty that claims to have the mandate of heaven. Then they become corrupt or weak. Some kind of horrible thing happens. Then the people say, oh, he's lost the mandate of heaven, but the new guy has it. So ancient China was very dependent upon trade with the Silk Road. The Chinese are very interesting because they didn't have any problem selling their stuff to other countries, but they're like, you don't have anything that we need. And that's pretty true because the Chinese were very, very advanced. It was very guarded, the idea of silk. We're actually going to learn about the Byzantine Empire, how they actually stole silk. They took silk pods, which are with the moth, the silkworm, makes a little cocoon, and they shove them into the handle of a cane, and they snuck them out. That's how silk will actually get outside of China. They do invent paper, so like legit paper from trees, not like papyrus from the reeds of the Egyptians. Porcelain, okay, so what we would call china. Silk, we mentioned already. They also will invent the compass. They invent ice cream and fireworks, among other things. And they're very famous for their tea. And while we're coffee drinkers in the United States, coffee is something that's not huge in the world at this time period. Now, the Ottoman Empire, who we'll talk about later in the year, around Turkey, they will develop coffee. But people very much drink tea. That is what people want at this time period. And so people in other parts of the world really desired what the Chinese had. So the very earliest dynasty that we have kind of any kind of evidence about is the Qin Dynasty, which we really don't know much about. There's not really a whole lot of archaeological evidence. Some say that they go back as early as 2500 BC or BCE. Some historians even say they don't even exist and that the Shang is the first dynasty, because the Shang Dynasty is the first dynasty that we actually have historical evidence for, which was about 1500 BC. And the Shang Dynasty had oracle bones, which they would take tortoise shells and they would write on them, and then they would heat them until they cracked. And then scribes or priests would then translate what they said based on how they threw them and how the shells cracked to interpret prophecy or their future. And so that's actually the first time that we've actually heard about that. Now, the Zhou Dynasty, which is the ZHOU. It's more like a hard kind of like the sound. So Zhou Dynasty, actually, some people even believe that they made up stories about the Qin Dynasty in order to like justify them taking over the Shang. So the Shang Dynasty, which is the first dynasty we actually have written record for, developed along the Huang, the Yellow River, about 1600, 1500 BC. And they had very wealthy landowners that were controlled by a king, but most people were peasant farmers. And even today in China, the majority of people are farmers. So here you can see these oracle bones that I was talking about. So you can see the tortoise shell, you can see like the cracks in it, you can see the writing. And so they would heat them until they would crack. And then depending where the crack would happen, that would be where they would translate them. They also practice ancestor worship, which is a very important part of Chinese culture today. Let me move this over to the side so it's not so little dots are bothering you, maybe. So the Shang Dynasty, this ancestor worship is that you pray to the ancestors who are in heaven with like all these different pantheon of gods, and they would then talk to your ancestors would talk to the gods to get things to happen for you. And they believe that, much like the people of Mesopotamia, that if you didn't properly worship the ancestors, treat them well, then the gods could cause destruction on the earth. Sometimes they would burn some kind of like, today would be like photographs, but back then a carved image or drawing or painting that would represent them. This is a big part of Confucianism, which we'll talk about later. And again, these are traditions that are still done in China today. So eventually we get the Zhou Dynasty, which lasts for quite a long time. They last for 800 years. They last from, mid 1000s to about 256 BC. They conquer the Shang Dynasty. They claim the mandate of heaven, of course. And they do a lot of really amazing things. They set up a feudal system, which is a farming system where the peasants farm the land, and in exchange for farming the land, the lords protected them to ensure that they would not be attacked by invaders. The nobles appointed relatives to kind of oversee everything, and the local lords had total authority over their land, and they just pledged allegiance or loyalty to the king, and really whoever had the mandate of heaven. They built roads, they expanded foreign trade, they obtained horses and formed a cavalry. They developed the crossbow, they started picture writing. So we could see here the Chinese character for country. And so the Chinese do not have an alphabet. Instead, they have a vast number of characters that represent images, sounds. So it's not an alphabet. So literally to read like a basic newspaper with like a 4th grade education, you have to understand about 4,000 different Chinese characters. When Chinese is spoken, it's also tonal. So by lifting or lowering your voice, you can actually change the meaning of a word. One of my roommates in college was Chinese American, and when she would talk to her mom, it was kind of funny because she would split between Chinese and American when she was talking. Like she would speak English and then she would speak Chinese. But when she was speaking Chinese, it would almost sound like she was singing because of the way that her tone would change based on what she was saying. They also invented the iron plow, and they developed flood control systems, which, knowing how undependable the Huang River was, this is also an important idea. They also began to be concerned about population growth because while China is a very large country, there's only small areas of China that's actually arable, meaning that the land is good for farming. They were eventually defeated by enemies who kind of came together and fought until the dynasty ended. Now, during this time period, there was a man by the name of Confucius. Okay, so Confucius, maybe you have heard his name before. And so Confucius, his name is actually Kongzai. He was born around 551 BC. And a lot of people often compare him to Socrates, who we're going to talk about in Greece. So he became a teacher, and he very much promoted order. He believed that everyone had a specific proper role in society. Now, Confucius never writes down his sayings or teachings. Instead, his followers did, and they were written down in something called the Analects. And he believed a couple of things. One, humans are good, not bad. Everything was focused on ethics, that you needed to make the right decision, to do what was morally good and right. So when we think Confucianism, we think ethics, okay? So it's that idea of duty and doing what is best for humanity, what is best for people. He believed very strongly in respect for family, especially elders, and a reverence for the past and its traditions. So ancestor worship is another important part. He said that there were 5 relationships, and you can see those listed here: parent and child, husband and wife, between siblings, between friends, and between the ruler and the subject. And your ruler was to be like a father, taking care of his children, and we were to obey him, but he was to do what was best for us. In all of these, the eldest, okay, so remember it's all about who's older, was always in charge. And men were over women in Chinese society, still are today, and very much a part of Confucius. But he did believe everybody has a specific role, and if everybody focused on following their role, then the world would be orderly. Sounds a little bit like Dharma that the Hindus did. He believed very strongly in something called filial piety, which means children should respect their parents. And the government has a duty to set example for right conduct. Now, Confucius's teachings are actually not accepted until about 100 years after his death. And so we'll see that they're not accepted during the Zhou Dynasty, but they become much bigger later on in society, and we'll talk about that when we get there. But Confucius's teachings are very important. You're going to do an activity where you're going to be identifying, I'm going to give you a statement, and you're going to tell me, is it true of one of the 3 philosophies? And this is your first philosophy. So, kind of everything being ethical, respect for your elders, emphasis on education. That's so much so that in order later on, when Confucianism becomes very accepted, in order to get a job in the government, you had to be an expert in the Analects, which remember is the collection of Confucius's teachings. Now, around this same time, there was a guy by the name of Lao Tzu who founded Daoism. You'll notice that Daoism is spelled either with a T or a D. The problem is when we're translating Chinese into English that the letters are not the same as the Latin alphabet that we use. We have to go by sounds. So Daoism wanted to make the world better and very much rejected social structure. And the whole idea was an emphasis on nature and that we have to return to nature and the external force of nature. And that external force of nature was the Tao. And Lao Tzu taught that there were 2 opposing forces in nature, the yin and yang. You may have heard it before. It's not yin yang. There's no G in yin. It's yin and yang. And so these 2 opposing forces were present in all of nature. Everything has both. So yin was like cool, dark, feminine, submissive. Yang is warm, light, male, and aggressive. And the idea is that you want to find a balance between those 2. Okay, so harmony with nature, simple life and inner peace, humility, being humble. So the yin and yang here, you can kind of see here this the opposing forces, but you got to work with both of them. So the dark and light work together. You can't be whole without having both sides. Now, Buddhism, of course, is going to spread into Asia, and there becomes more of a worship of Buddha here. So Mahayana, that's one of the different types of Buddhism. And so Buddha, remember, was just a great teacher before, but he becomes more kind of worshipped almost as a god, not quite. Now, the third type of philosophy is legalism, which was actually started by a guy by the name of Han Fei's. Here's a quote. When a wise ruler governs a state, he cannot suppose that people will do the good things to him, but he uses people so that they couldn't do the bad things. So legalism is you have a very strong ruler. He does whatever he has to. The end justifies the means. He doesn't really care. It's the opposite of Confucianism, okay? People are born evil. Remember, Confucius believes we're born good, so people are born evil. We have to have strict laws and punishments because if we don't, who knows what people will do? They're evil, right? So we got to keep them in charge. The best type of government uses strength, okay? Remember that Confucius says that the government should be like a father, and the Taoists could care less about government. And the ruler should never show compassion. So that's really against the humility of the Taoists and even Confucius. So the Qin Dynasty comes next, and this is created by Qin Huang. He conquered almost all the regions of China. So he basically unites China into one empire. And actually, China is named after him, Qin, China. And so he used legalism. This guy's pretty harsh. Qin Huangdi is a very interesting guy because here's the thing. Qin Huangdi is not a nice guy, but man, he gets things done. So he conquers northern China, unites all of China that really kind of had organized at this point for the first time. And the way that he organized and set up government, it lasts for 2,000 years. So pretty significant, his legacy. He reorganized the empire into military districts with officials to govern them. He standardized coins. He even standardized the size of a wagon wheel. You know, like tires today, you can go buy a tire anywhere, right? It'll fit your car. Obviously, there's different sizes, but they're standard. He standardized wagon wheels so that you could get a wagon wheel to replace yours very easily. He standardized coins, weights, and measures so that people weren't cheating you out of things, okay? You know, he realizes kind of how important these things are. He also builds the first Great Wall. And remember that this is an important thing, the Great Wall was built to keep out invaders, specifically Mongol invaders. So this was supposed to be the first line of defense. And the original parts of the wall today are labeled so you know where they are. But the more kind of famous part of the wall was built much, much, much later. You can see here kind of where the Great Wall of China ran. It is over 2,000 miles long. It's huge. Remember, he just started it. He didn't do the whole thing today. He's also famous for his terracotta statues. Now, like I said, he's also famous for the world's first book burning. So anybody who was opposed to him, he pretty much wiped them out. So I'm going to show you a couple of things here. Let me make this bigger here. All right, guys. So the terracotta statues. So here's what happens. So he wanted to have soldiers to go with him into the afterlife. So he ordered that every single soldier would pose for their double. And they had to pose for their double. So there are literally thousands and thousands of these statues, and each one of them looks different. So you can see here, this is the whole like kind of tomb overlay, and they were all buried. Now, archaeologists have not dug up the whole thing because we want to be preserved if we have better techniques. Here's what happened. There was a farmer in the 70s. He's digging land, and suddenly he finds this terracotta statues. Well, what happened is after Qin Huangdi died, he made all these people build these huge statues and everything. They were so mad when he died, they burned and torched the whole place. And so here, this is what an actual terracotta statue would have looked like. So when we look at them, we don't realize that back then they would have all been painted these beautiful colors. And each statue is unique and different. And that's the part that's amazing. There's literally thousands of statues. Here's another one you can kind of see. And look at them. They're all in rows, just like they would be fighting. And so these areas here, this would be the parts where they haven't dug up things. Because remember, archaeologists don't dig up the whole thing. They want to make sure that we can have things in the past. You can see here, they're kind of some replicas. They have replicas that they do put around. And they basically, everybody had to pose like your head, and then it was slid into kind of the other part. So it's absolutely amazing. This is one of my life things that I want to do is I want to go see. They even had horses. You see, they even had horses in there. Here's another image. Just absolutely kind of insane, all this stuff that he did. All right, let me make myself smaller again. So his warriors were built to protect him in the afterlife. And then again, after his death, they basically were like, yeah. Sorry, guys, I'm having problems moving my little thing. All right, there we go. All right, so you can see here's another picture. So definitely on my list of things I want to see in my life before I die, on my bucket list. All right, so the Han Dynasty comes next, and the Han Dynasty is, after Qin, we'd had this law code. He really made the farmers mad because they dig canals and built roads. Of course, he built the Great Wall. He had so many taxes, again, did the world's first book burning. He censored what people could read because, remember, it's legalism. You can't disagree with me. He was very cruel to his subjects, and he lost the mandate of heaven. He actually dies, though, and the new dynasty that comes in is the Han Dynasty. And guess what they're going to bring? The nicer guy. They're going to bring Confucianism. Now, look how much larger the Han Dynasty is. It lasts for 200, 100, or 350 years. And they return to Confucian government. They create one of the most important things, which is a civil service exam. So I actually worked for the post office one winter when I was in college, and I had to go take a test called the civil service exam. Anybody who works for the government has to take one of these exams. And it's just kind of like a basic test to see if you know like basic things. Wasn't super hard. And people back then, they had to do that too. That's because they appointed people by jobs by merit. Okay, meaning that you earned the job. It's not just on who you know. Patronage is on who you know, who you're friends with. So a civil service exam was much more fair, and people had to be educated and trained in the Analects, the teachings of Confucius. They did water mills for grinding grain. They did iron casting, which is going to lead to the invention of steel, which steel is even better than iron. Steel is lighter and more malleable, meaning that it can be bent better than iron. The Silk Road continues. It becomes even better. They developed a better type of paper, and then they used the rudder. So if you know on a ship, the rudder is the part that actually turns your ship, and this allows the ships to sail against the wind. They are going to develop some amazing large ships later on. They could have made it to the New World, but they decided to close themselves off to trade. So we can see here the Silk Road, which leaves from China, goes across desert, mountains, and then finally to Constantinople in Europe. All right, so many things that are important about the Chinese. So just real quickly, we'll just remind that we had Confucianism and legalism and Daoism. Those are going to be things that are going to be on your that you need to know. Inventions, silk, paper, the wheelbarrow. I don't think I mentioned that before. The compass, gunpowder, crossbow, steel, so many different things. They also developed the same calendar that we have, a solar calendar, 365 and 1/4 day. They even followed Halley's Comet. They understood astronomy. They developed acupuncture. So I used to think acupuncture, So I have plantar fasciitis, which means that my foot has issues. And I actually did acupuncture right before COVID hit, and it was helping. They they understood the importance of nutrition and vitamins. These are things that Europeans had no idea about. China is so much more advanced than everybody for a very long time. They advanced in fertilizing crops, veterinary medicine. I mean, just amazing. This whole idea even of civil servants, that people should have a job in the government because they know stuff and they're good at it based on merit. Peasants, though, still make up 90% of the population, but they are valued. In Confucius society, it's better to work with your hands and work on the land than it is to deal with money. All right, so I have some extra videos on Confucianism, legalism, and Daoism, and one of them is starred that I would suggest you watch because it talks about legalism, but it does a good job of kind of talking about all of them and talks a little bit about Qin Huang. I also have an Arizona Smith video on China if you'd like to watch it. It is, of course, optional, but if you need a little bit more information, he does a great job and he kind of shows you about the terracotta statues. All right, have a great day.